On the night of June 6, 1966, three fortune seekers from the village of Gur near Usak in western Turkey broke into a 2,500-year-old tomb. They used dynamite to blast through the roof. What they found inside would ignite one of the most significant cultural property battles of the 20th century. Buried within that tomb chamber, believed to belong to a Lydian princess, lay a collection of 363 separate artifacts, dating back to the 7th century BCE. Gold jewelry, silver vessels, objects crafted with extraordinary skill by artisans of the ancient Lydian kingdom, a civilization once ruled by King Croesus, a name still associated with legendary wealth today. The Lydians themselves hold a distinct place in ancient history. Centered on the city of Sardis, not far from where this tomb was found, they are widely credited with minting the world's first coined money, stamping standardized value onto small pieces of electrum centuries before coinage spread across the ancient Mediterranean. Wealth in Lydia was not simply a matter of gold in the ground. It was a kingdom that had, in a very real sense, invented the idea of currency itself. King Croesus is credited with refining that system further, introducing separate pure gold and pure silver coinage, a reform that later Persian and Greek currencies would draw on directly once Lydia itself had fallen. The three men who broke into the tomb that night were eventually identified and prosecuted in Turkish courts, though the penalties handed down at the time were reportedly light compared to the scale of what had been taken, a mismatch that later became part of the broader case for stronger cultural heritage protection in Turkish law. The name Karun, given to this treasure in Turkish tradition, carries its own layer of meaning. It echoes Karun, a wealthy figure remembered in regional tradition, as a cautionary tale of riches and downfall, a name that made an almost natural fit for a hoard of gold pulled violently out of the earth. The treasure never had a chance to reach a museum through proper channels. Instead, it was smuggled out of Turkey in separate shipments, routed through Izmir and Amsterdam, carefully broken up to avoid drawing attention. Between 1967 and 1968, piece by piece, the entire collection was purchased by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. For nearly 2 decades, the treasure sat in an American museum cataloged and displayed, its true origins never disclosed to the public. Then, in 1987, Turkey filed a formal legal claim. The case dragged on for 6 years, a slow, determined effort to prove what Turkish authorities already knew. The collection had been looted, smuggled, and acquired under circumstances the Metropolitan Museum could not defend. Investigative journalism played its own role in exposing the case, with reporting at the time laying out just how much museum staff had known and chosen not to disclose when the pieces were first purchased. In September 1993, facing an imminent trial, the museum made its decision. Records that later came to light suggested some museum staff in the 1960s had likely known the objects were stolen at the time of purchase. Facing that reality in open court, the Metropolitan Museum agreed to return the entire collection. Today, what has become known as the Karun Treasure, named for the legendary King Croesus, or Karun in Turkish tradition, is displayed at the Usak Museum of Archaeology, back in the province where it was found, 27 years after it was blasted out of the ground in a single reckless night. The story did not end cleanly even after the return. In the years following repatriation, one of the collection's most famous pieces, a winged brooch shaped like a mythical sea creature, drew renewed scrutiny when questions arose over whether the piece on display was genuine. Investigation eventually traced the substitution to a museum insider, and the case became a genuine scandal in its own right, complete with an arrest and a criminal trial, a reminder that protecting a recovered treasure can prove nearly as difficult as recovering it in the first place. The Karun treasure is still cited today in discussions of cultural property law, alongside other high-profile repatriation cases, such as the Euphronios crater, as one of the clearest examples of a source country successfully reclaiming what had been taken from it. Museums and legal scholars alike point to the case as a turning point, a moment when documented provenance, or the lack of it, began to matter far more than it once had in the international art trade. A dynamite explosion in a quiet Anatolian village, and decades later justice finally caught up with what it had uncovered: gold that had traveled from a smuggler's shipment to a Manhattan museum case and back again, before finally settling where it had been buried all along. The Troy Treasure, Schliemann's Journey, Turkey, Germany, Russia. In 1873, on the mound of Hissarlik in northwestern Turkey, Heinrich Schliemann's excavation of ancient Troy produced a discovery that would travel farther and cause more controversy than almost any archaeological find of the 19th century. Schliemann called it Priam's treasure, naming it after the legendary king of Troy from Homer's Iliad. The hoard included gold jewelry of striking craftsmanship, diadems, earrings, bracelets, and thousands of smaller gold beads and ornaments along with silver and bronze vessels. Schliemann, convinced he had found physical proof of Homer's Troy, moved quickly to secure the discovery for himself. Too quickly, according to the terms of his own excavation permit. Later work would complicate Schliemann's own claims about the find. German archaeologist Wilhelm Dorpfeld, continuing excavations at Hissarlik after Schliemann's death, determined that the layer containing the treasure actually belonged to an earlier city, predating the Troy described in Homer's Iliad by roughly 1,000 years. Schliemann had found something real and extraordinary, just not quite the exact layer he believed he had found. Schliemann's agreement with Ottoman authorities required him to share fines from the dig with the Ottoman state. Instead, according to most historical accounts, he smuggled the treasure out of the country, reportedly with his wife Sophia's help, and transported it to Germany well outside the reach of Ottoman claims. A now famous photograph shows Sophia Schliemann wearing pieces from the hoard, gold jewelry draped across her in a portrait that became, for better or worse, one of the defining images of 19th century archaeology and of the ethical questions that have followed the field ever since. The Ottoman government was unsurprisingly furious. Legal disputes followed, and Schliemann eventually paid a settlement, though the treasure itself never returned to Ottoman hands. It remained in Germany, eventually finding a home in Berlin's museums, where it stayed on public display for decades. Then came the Second World War. As Soviet forces advanced on Berlin in 1945, the treasure, along with countless other artifacts held in the city's museums, vanished from public record. For nearly half a century, its fate remained genuinely unknown, presumed by many to have been destroyed or lost entirely amid the chaos of the war's final days. It had not been destroyed. In 1993, the Russian government publicly acknowledged what had actually happened. Soviet troops had seized the treasure as war trophy material in 1945, transporting it to Moscow, where it had been held in secret, out of public view, inside the storerooms of the Pushkin Museum for close to 50 years. The revelation reopened a dispute with 3 separate claimants, each with a case worth taking seriously. Germany, which had legally housed the treasure for decades before the war, Russia, which now physically possessed it, and Turkey, where the treasure had been excavated in the first place from soil that had never consented to its removal. Turkish authorities have long argued that the treasure's rightful home was always Anatolia, regardless of which European power held it at any given point in the 20th century, and that Schliemann's original removal of the hoard was itself the founding injustice from which every later dispute descended. The treasure remains in Moscow today, still displayed at the Pushkin Museum, still the subject of periodic diplomatic tension between Russia, Germany, and Turkey, none of whom have reached a resolution that fully satisfies the others. The wider site of Troy itself has fared somewhat better in international recognition. UNESCO added the archaeological site at Hissarlik to its World Heritage List in 1998, acknowledging its exceptional importance to human history, even as the most famous objects pulled from its soil remain scattered across museums thousands of kilometers away. Turkish officials have continued to raise the treasure's return in diplomatic talks with both Germany and Russia, part of a broader national effort to recover heritage removed during the era of unregulated foreign excavation. What began as a single celebrated archaeological discovery has become, over a century and a half, something closer to a case study in how colonial-era archaeology handled the treasures it found, removed without full consent, displayed as trophies of discovery rather than shared heritage, and passed, war after war, from one nation's hands to another's, never quite finding its way back to the ground it came from. Priam's treasure still glitters behind glass in Moscow today, a long way, in every sense, from the mound at Hizarlik, where it was buried for over 3,000 years before Schliemann's shovel ever found it. Yedikule, the Byzantine gold legend, Istanbul, Turkey. Along the old land walls of Istanbul, near where the Sea of Marmara meets the ancient fortifications built to protect Constantinople, 7 massive towers still stand together, connected by walls that have watched over this city for over 15 centuries. This is Yedikule, the Fortress of 7 Towers. Part of the structure incorporates something even older than the Ottoman fortress built around it: the Golden Gate, a ceremonial triumphal archway originally constructed under Byzantine rule, used for centuries as the entrance through which victorious emperors formally entered Constantinople after successful military campaigns. Ancient accounts describe the gate in its prime as genuinely gilded, its doors and adjoining statues, including a bronze chariot figure, covered or plated in gold as a display of imperial triumph. That association with gold, real in the Byzantine period, seems to have never fully left the site. Centuries later, under Ottoman rule, Yedikule took on a different but related role. From the reign of Fatih Sultan Mehmed in 1458 until the era of Sultan Abdulhamid I in the late 18th century, the fortress served as an actual state treasury, the Hazine-i-Humayun, where a significant portion of the Ottoman Empire's gold reserves were physically stored, protected by the fortress's thick walls and defensible position. For over 3 centuries, in other words, Yedikule genuinely was a place where enormous quantities of gold were kept. It is against this real historical backdrop that the fortress's folklore developed. Local legend holds that treasure remains hidden somewhere within Yedikule to this day, sealed beneath one of the towers or behind the old gate itself. According to the story, this treasure is not simply forgotten or unclaimed, but actively guarded, protected by unseen spiritual forces that bring misfortune to anyone who attempts to find or disturb it. A separate strand of local folklore ties into Yedikule's other historical function. For much of the Ottoman period, the fortress also served as a state prison, the Yedikule Zindanlari, holding foreign ambassadors during times of war alongside Ottoman prisoners of both political and criminal standing. According to one popular version of the treasure legend, a prisoner held within these dungeons is said to have hidden a private hoard of gold somewhere within the fortress walls before his fate was sealed, a treasure that, if the story is true, has never been recovered. The prison's real history carries its own dark weight without needing any legend attached to it. In 1622, the young Sultan Osman II was strangled inside Yedikule following a Janissary revolt, one of the most shocking events of the era. An Ottoman sultan killed by his own soldiers within the very walls that were supposed to guard the empire's wealth. That single documented death has, over centuries of retelling, folded itself into the fortress's wider reputation as a place where valuable things, whether gold or a sultan's own life, were never entirely safe. No official record supports either version of the treasure legend. Ottoman treasury records, where they survive, account for the gold that was formerly stored and later moved as the treasury function shifted elsewhere. There is no documented case of a discovered hoard matching either the guarded tower story or the hidden prisoner story. And yet the legend persists, generation after generation, in a way that pure invention rarely manages on its own. Historians studying local folklore suggest this durability comes from the fortress's genuine history rather than despite it. Yedikule really was a treasury for centuries. It really was gilded in its earliest Byzantine form. The soil beneath it really did, at various points across history, hold enormous quantities of gold. A legend claiming more gold remains hidden somewhere within these walls does not have to work very hard to feel plausible, standing as it does on a foundation of documented fact. Yedikule sits within a much larger monument. The Theodosian Walls, Constantinople's 5th-century land fortifications, recognized today as part of the historic areas of Istanbul on UNESCO's World Heritage List since 1985. Few structures anywhere on Earth have watched over a single city continuously for this long, surviving sieges, earthquakes, and centuries of shifting empires, with Yedikule standing as one of their best preserved and most storied sections. Visitors to Yedikule today walk through towers that once held both a nation's wealth and its prisoners, structures whose silence, as one local account puts it, has done more to keep the treasure legend alive than any single storyteller ever could. Whether any gold still waits beneath those ancient stones, no one has ever proven, one way or the other.